I'm not the only one that's noticed that there's a progressive takeover. Common Core implementation is progressive indoctrination. I've been reading a book called The Unthinkable. It's about how people behave when there's an emergency. For instance, 9/11, the building's coming down, the glass is shattering in, or the water is receding at the beach and there's a tsunami coming. People freeze. They're actually in denial. And so after they've kind of gone through their paralysis, then they do a lot of time-consuming things like gathering, if it's a plane crash, they're gathering their carry-on, or they're sort of senselessly finishing their drink at the bar if the hotel is on fire. It's very hard to get through that stage of denial. And I feel that the progressives are trying to get their agenda implemented so before we notice, before we wake up and see what's happening. And then the second stage, when there's a crisis, a danger of some sort, is that you can't decide what to do. People mill around, they talk to each other. It took people twice the amount of time that the engineers thought to get out of the 9/11 buildings, the Trade Center buildings, because they were talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do. In terms of Nazi Germany, a lot of you have probably read some of that history. There's something called business as usual. People just kept doing the same thing and not getting out of the country. So I'm thinking in terms of the progressive takeover, all those attempts, whether it's healthcare, education, the economy, we have to get through that denial, and we have to know what to do and take action. Now, what's happened with the Common Core is that, as Amy will relate, we're hearing one thing from the Department of Education and the governor and the administration, but the facts are telling us something else. You can see from what she's going to show you that these people were kept in the dark. These were the people on the national scale who were implementing, the state was implementing, but we were kept in the dark. And we're properly incensed about that. Now, what the Common Core does, it attacks from a lot of areas. I was listening to NPR over the weekend because you have to be informed. And they talked about Common Core. And they talked about, oh, well, parents actually interfere with the test scores of their children. They distract them from their math and their literacy achievements. They're trying to undermine mom and dad, and they do it in a lot of different ways. Not only cutting them out of the decisions, but trying to take away their authority in the Common Core curriculum. For instance, there's a first grade suggested Common Core curriculum that you should tell your parents when they tell you to clean up your room that they're nagging you. Nag is the right answer to that question for a first grader. So the truth is, mom and dad need our help. And what we're hearing from the progressive people is feelings are more important than reason. You can always change the numbers. I mean, their math, Amy will tell you what they're doing with their math program. And just feel like a victim and let it happen to you. Don't do anything about it. One of the problems we've had is that Christy Hooley is the only teacher in Wyoming who's been willing to stand up and speak because the others are intimidated. When we had Dr. Stotsky here, she said that she had tried in several different states to try to get teachers to step up and speak about what's happening, but they're afraid of losing their jobs. And so our job is to have a voice, and us speak out so that makes it safe for them to speak out and be active in their schools. So here are the poor little ducklings. I mean, the thing I said about the Common Core is, you know, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, it is a duck. It is a progressive takeover. You can get through the denial stage. And here the Common Core standards are turning the little kids into duck soup. Here's the you will pay, ready-made duck soup standard product. So this kind of thing is what Amy will elaborate for you. Please come on in and make yourselves comfortable. I'll wait a minute while you find a good seat for yourselves. I'm glad you came. It's good to see everybody here. So it's time to stand up and fight back. And we put this presentation into 3 sections. One is this: let's not be in denial. Let's not wonder what to do. Let's get the facts and move on it. Amy's going to give you the story. And then we're going to give you some action items. Sven will talk a little bit about backpacking. And we also costed out some of the alternatives to public school education. So please, go ahead, Amy.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to walk you through a couple of things. So, section 1, I'm just going to give you a brief summary of the history of federal incursions into education, and then just a brief explanation of what standards are for those of you who may not understand standards. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they arrived here in Wyoming, and finally, we're going to have a little discussion of potential changes and reforms we can make. First of all, just a quick overview of the federal involvement in education. It really began in 1965 with President Johnson's Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was part of President Johnson's war on poverty. Some of you may remember. It was his Great Society plan. And what's important to note about this was, for the first time, the federal government came in and said that the federal government had something the states did not have. It was really couched as a moral imperative that the federal government could do something the states simply could not do. The country was going through desegregation. Title I funds were a part of ESAEA, and the Title I funds were there to try to bridge the gap between children, the haves and the have-nots, essentially. So the high-performing kids and the kids that are in at-risk homes. And so that's important to note, because it really was, for the first time, the federal government was saying, hey, we can do something that the states cannot do. In 1979, President Carter signed the Department of Education Reorganization Act. In 1965, when ESEA was signed, we had an Office of Education federally. So it was not a cabinet level position. In 79, and there was a lot of discussion between 65 and the late 70s about bumping that up to a cabinet level position. Well, they did just that in 1979. With all the power that a cabinet level federal position has, it was basically bestowed on the then Department of Education. Then in 1980, Ronald Reagan swept in to the White House. And one of his platform positions was actually to undo what Carter had done. There was a lot of discussion nationally. Yeah, we don't want this. We don't want, we're going from office to department. We realize what this means. This means that the federal government's going to get more and more and more and more and more involved in education. Unfortunately, Reagan didn't fulfill that promise. He actually didn't do it. As a matter of fact, his second, the nation's second, and his second Secretary of Education, Terrence Bell, actually convened a group together and put out, if you all remember, some of you do, A Nation at Risk, this national report that said it had 49 different findings in it. In that finding were several that basically reaffirmed what Johnson had said in 65, which is that the federal government, there's a national imperative that the federal government be involved in education. It's a national interest that the federal government be involved in education. Okay, so standards-based reform going on federally. In the 80s and 90s, we had the beginnings of what can be called standards-based reform. Under Goals 2000, President Clinton, which was actually passed by Congress, it created a National Education Standard Council, and their job was, it was really a precursor. Their job was to create voluntary national content standards and voluntary national student performance standards that would define what all students know and be able to do. That failed. It failed miserably. And what these folks learned, and these same folks are now actors in the Common Core, what they learned was, first of all, don't call it national. It doesn't work if you call it national. It was a huge failure because it was considered, even though it was voluntary, it was considered national standards, and states did not like it and wouldn't stand for it. Then in early 2000, we have No Child Left Behind, passed by President Bush Jr. No Child Left Behind, if many of you probably know, it continued on this standard-based reform. It required states to set standards And then it asked them to measure those standards. So they had to build a statewide standardized test to measure those standards. The federal government set some requirements within No Child Left Behind. They set what's called AMOs, Annual Measurable Objectives. They set them. But states tested for them themselves, and states set their own standards. So inside that, when it was passed in 2002, it sort of started a clock ticking. And one of the big goals of No Child Left Behind was that states had to be at proficiency in math and reading by 2014. So here we are at 2013. No Child Left Behind is still the law of the land, and the clock is ticking. And I will get to why that's significant in a little bit. So some problems inside No Child Left Behind. First of all, states were allowed to set their own standards. So because President Bush, being a Republican, didn't want to make this too prescriptive for states, because there was a lot of discussion about, again, having a national set of standards, they decided, well, we're going to let the states set their own standards. However, they also told the states at the same time, and within No Child Left Behind was the understanding that if you didn't meet proficiency, you were going to get in trouble. So guess what states did? They set their standards as low as they could possibly set them because they were incentivized not to set them high. They recognized inside No Child Left Behind they were going to get penalized. So states set their standards low. Wyoming was one of them. Also, the punishment, so if you weren't meeting proficiency, the punishment was basically the same for all of the states. But the standards were different because states set their own standards. This is significant because it created an inequity problem. States were very upset. This is a problem that the Common Core is trying to correct by forcing down a national standard. And you'll hear this argument from Department of Education officials and others that we have to be able to look at our kids against North Carolina's kids and be able to see, are they doing well? What they don't mention is they also want it because they want everyone to have the same set of standards so that when the penalties come down, they're fair. Because it's not fair now. If you set your bar higher than another state and then you get penalized and the other state doesn't, there's a fairness problem. So No Child Left Behind, a federal solution to a problem, created even more problems that we are now trying to correct with yet another federal problem. Standards, what are they and why? Standards define the knowledge and skills that students need to know. So Wyoming has always set standards in a very, very, very general sense. So I spent some time at the law library next to the Capitol. Wyoming has in our statutes from 1917 forward a very brief discussion that the State Board of Education would set standards. It's not prescriptive at all. It's very, very broad and very general. It just says general education standards. However, as I said, the 1980s and 90s really began this standard-based reform and really began being much more prescriptive. Now, if you look at the evolution of our statutes, you'll see that they're very prescriptive. They talk about years of math, years of science, that sort of thing. So the Common Core themselves, the Common Core right now is a set of nationally developed K through 12 English language arts and math. Those are the two areas that were developed as the Common Core. They're called college and career ready. So they've been deemed to be college and career ready. And this is important. If you look up on our map, this is important because a lot of experts in standard development, like Dr. Stotsky, who came to Wyoming 2 weeks ago, have talked about how if you're going to develop a set of college and career ready standards, who would you go to tell you if they really are college and career ready? Well, you would go to your university mathematicians, your university literature professors. Your mathematicians, your engineers at your engineering school, kids that want to get into engineering school, medical school, business school, anywhere where they're going to need higher math, they should really be the ones to determine if they're college and career ready. Well, guess who was completely left out of the development of these standards? Those folks. So we've had national mathematicians like Dr. Milgram, James Milgram from Stanford, who have said these standards are not college and career ready. As a matter of fact, they're going to handicap those higher students from getting into universities for things like engineering or medicine. So states were encouraged to adopt them by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, who actually were the ones who developed these standards. And the Common Core standards themselves are copyrighted. So Wyoming adopted these standards, but we don't own them. There's a term of use. If you go on to the corestandards.org, you'll find the term of use of how we can use these standards and how we cannot. So standards aren't curriculum. We hear that, you'll hear that a lot. You'll hear that discussed. Wait a minute. Standards are not curriculum, so let's not panic. We're not telling the local districts what to do. Wyoming has a constitutional amendment that says very clearly that the local districts will set curriculum. The state cannot prescribe textbooks. So this is sort of the wall of defense that some like to say, listen, don't get worried about standards because they aren't curriculum. But let's just go through standards. So curriculum. Curriculum is set at the local district. The local districts decide the textbooks, and it would be great if this was all we had on the screen and I just went to the next one, but that's not how it works. Standards and assessment are bookends to curriculum. They basically stand on either side. The state prescribes standards, and now we actually have national standards being prescribed, and the state basically sets assessment. And now we see nationally that there's going to be assessments because we have 2 national consortiums, Wyoming's involved in 1. So curriculum doesn't stand there all by itself. It's not in a vacuum. It's involved around standards and around assessments. So the state sets standards, and then we expect kids to get there. Curriculum is the vehicle to get them there. But because they're now being much more prescriptive in both standards and assessment, what's happening to the local districts? Well, they're disappearing. Their ability to maneuver and have that freedom, both the district and parents, is basically going away. So here's some connections. I know this is kind of small, but I just wanted to lay out as best I could the connection between the Common Core, the race to the top, and flexibility waivers. All of these things are interchangeable. They're basically working together. So February of 2009, if you remember, there was a bunch of stimulus dollars that were passed by Congress. Well, $4.35 billion of those funds were earmarked for education reform. And inside the ARA bill, there were 4 areas of reform that were actually named. Standards and assessment was one of them. And it was very, very general. The wording inside the ARA bill is very, very general. April of 2009, so 2 months later, the Wyoming Department of Education joined 40 states in a national conference call where we just started to investigate what we were going to do. And we were briefed about the Common Core, and basically in that conference call, states were told that the MOA being the Memorandum of Agreement that the Common Core folks wanted all the states to sign, was about to be sent out to governors and to superintendents, and that states would have 3 weeks to decide. The standards had not been written yet, so the standards weren't there. But states were going to have 3 weeks, the governor and the superintendent, to decide. Sometime in May, our MOA, the one that our governor and superintendent signed, is not actually dated, but we know it's May because of other things that were happening. Sometime in May, the MOA was delivered, and Governor Freudenthal and Superintendent McBride signed it. So he essentially put us on the hook for this whole Common Core process. On June 9th, the Common Core Initiative nationally sent out a press release touting the fact that 49 states had signed on. So 49 states decided in a 3-week time period, their governors and their superintendents, that they were going to sign on to this, even though, again, the standards had not been written. In July, so 1 month later, Race to the Top was unveiled. Race to the Top is a competitive grant. It's got the $4.35 billion in it. It's a lot of money for states, very exciting. So phase 1 applications were going to be due 6 months later, June of the next year. In the winter of 2009, our Department of Education decided that they were going to go ahead and apply for Race to the Top funds, and they began to develop their application. And in January of 2010, we sent our application to the federal government asking for $164 million in Race to the Top funds. Now, fast forward to August 2011, President Obama releases his ESEA reauthorization, a blueprint for reform. This was his big education initiative. It was never passed by Congress. He didn't go through Congress. He just unveiled it. But he directs Secretary Duncan to begin a plan to give states relief from No Child Left Behind. This is the third part of this whole scheme. First, we have Common Core developed. Then we hook in Race to the Top monies. And then finally, we try to grab states through flexibility waivers. And these were considered relief from No Child Left Behind. Remember when I said it started a clock ticking? States had to be proficient by 2014. Well, guess what? We're not even right. States are not close. Wyoming is not close. Other states are not close. So all the states were looking to get out from under No Child Left Behind and the penalties that were going to happen in 2014. So by February of 2012, 11 states had already been granted waivers. We continue on. I wanted to put this up here just to talk a little bit about the MOA. So As you saw in May of 2009, then Governor Freudenthal and then Superintendent McBride signed our MOA. This is the commissioner from Texas. They have similar statutory language. In Wyoming, it is our State Board of Education who has the statutory authority to set and review and change standards. What Commissioner Scott said at the time was that his first experience began when he, like all the other governors that spring, the MOA arrived at his desk. And the first thing he asked was, can I read them? I'd like to read the standards before I sign this. He thought that was totally appropriate. And basically what he was told is they haven't been written and we want your signature, so sign now. And this is his testimony, so I'm going off of his words. And he basically said that's absurd. And I think the most important part here is he said, I don't have the legal authority to do that because our law requires our State Board of Education. The law that's exactly the same law as Wyoming's. The only difference is that Texas has an elected state board. Our state board is appointed. But the law is the same. In Wyoming, statutorily, it is the State Board of Education that has the authority to set standards. So he refused. So Scott never signed it. He said, nope, I'm not going to do it. And he realized later on that really what this initiative was about control. That it co-opted people, states, into beginning this process having never even saw the standards. They hadn't even saw them. So these standards were written behind closed doors. And at the time of his testimony, which was 2 years ago, they didn't even know who the writers were. So not only had it not been written, but when they were written for quite a while, no one even knew who the writers were. So important points to remember. First of all, no federal legislation has been used to implement the Common Core or the flexibility waivers. Now, people can say, hooray, see, that just tells us that the federal government's not involved. But clearly the federal government has been involved because they've hooked both the flexibility waivers and then Race to the Top into these Common Core standards. So Race to the Top was funded through ARA, but ARA was very vague. So what President Obama has done, and we've seen him do this in other areas as well, he's really legislated through the executive branch, through financial means and other means. So in ARA, there were 4 areas of reform: teacher quality, turning around low-performing schools, standards and assessment, and data systems. And it was about that vague. I mean, literally, that's about as vague as ARA was. What he then did was create the Race to the Top program and got really specific. He got specific about having to have college and career-ready standards. And then in the flexibility waivers, he got really specific and said you had to have college and career-ready standards. And the way they're described, the only thing that they can be talking about is either the Common Core standards or states could have gone to their local university and created standards all themselves. And you have to realize that standard creation work is not quick work. It takes a long time when you bring people together and create standards. So the Common Core was the fastest way, and the Race to the Top clock was ticking. You had to apply, you had deadlines, you had to get in there and get your applications in. So also, for most states like Wyoming, there was no state legislative action taken. Granted, in Wyoming statutorily it is the state board, but your local legislators didn't know anything about this. It was your appointed State Board of Education who did this, and your governor and your superintendent. Also, many U.S. congressmen have voiced very strong concerns about what President Obama has been doing, both with the flexibility waivers and with Race to the Top. They're really concerned about what they consider these non-statutory provisions, provisions that were never passed by Congress, but that President Obama has basically been able to capitalize. So what we've seen is essentially an overhaul of public education, really accomplished by going around elected legislators and your Congress. Wyoming's path. So we've touched on a few of these things. In the spring, Governor Freudenthal signed the MOA with Superintendent McBride. Again, the standards had not been written. Wyoming, in that MOA, Wyoming promised to submit to the development process, which was clearly a national process. No one from Wyoming was involved in developing these standards. We sent no one was at the table. Also, we were on the hook for submitting to the national validation process. So once the standards were created by this handful of folks behind closed doors, no minutes were kept. We have no idea what discussions were had. Then they did a validation process where they brought about 24 folks in, and national folks. Dr. Sandra Stotsky was one of them. Dr. James Milgram was another. And they basically said, okay, now validate them. Tell us they're great. Well, Dr. Stotsky and Dr. Milgram, the only 2 folks on that 24 committee's national validation committee who were content experts. Dr. Milgram is a mathematician. I mean, he basically works for the federal government at Los Alamos, handling some of our country's highest security matters. He's an incredible mathematician. He refused to sign off on them, and so did Dr. Stotsky, who is well known for her work in Massachusetts, setting some of the best national standards. Standards, by the way, that Massachusetts threw away for the Common Core. So Wyoming was on the hook to comply with this whole rigid adoption process, how we had to adopt them and how in the timeline. And that spring, the department actually created a memo that we were able to get our hands on in which they said the Wyoming State Board of Education has not been a part of this discussion and that this could be problematic. So they even recognized that, wait a minute, it is the state board that has the statutory authority. This might be a problem. That fall, the Department of Education briefs our state board for what seems to be the first time. It's the first time I can find it in any public records. And in that same meeting, the state board decides to set up a timeline of how they're going to adopt these standards, including ELA. And their timeline was to start reviewing in April and end in January. So April of 2010 and in January of 2012. It's a long process, 2 years. However, that fall, Laramie County School District 1, the school district here, began to transition to the Common Core. I've spoken to, and the Department of Education has admitted that is absolutely true. I've spoken to the superintendent here and also the assessment, some of their curriculum directors. They both told me similar stories, and that is that Superintendent McBride came to them and said, this is going to happen, so go ahead and start converting to the Common Core. We have, of course, 6 districts in the state that educate over 50% of our students. These big districts like Laramie County 1, it's a little bit like turning around an aircraft carrier. So if you want to do this, you got to kind of get started on it. Clearly, they were going to move to the Common Core. No public testimony had been taken. No parents had been notified. Nothing had been done. But we had the largest school district in the state converting to the Common Core. That following January, the state board, or the Superintendent McBride basically briefs the state board on our race to the top application, saying that we had this application and that he felt we had a good chance of getting the grant. That spring, the department also hired McRel to do a crosswalk, so to look at our old standards versus the new standards and make all these decisions. So they were expending funds. I think it was about $80,000. I have a request in to find out how much that contract was for. In April, on the April 16th State Board meeting, the clock is clearly ticking, and Superintendent McBride says, we need to figure out how we can work with the Common Core standards by 2015. Otherwise, it could affect the federal dollars we receive. So you can see there's clearly a push. We're going to move this forward. We're going to move this forward. June 16th, the State Board adopts the Common Core standards. And the motion, you can read it there. The board approves the adoption of 100% of the Common Core state standards. It goes on. Now, Susan alluded to this. Since that time, and all the research I have done, I am using source documents that were created at the time these events were happening. Since then, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Department of Education came out with their own timeline in which they try to explain away a lot of these things, where they essentially say that this vote was not a vote for adoption, although it clearly says, and the motion clearly was in the minutes, a motion to adopt. They say this was a motion to consider. So it's just a procedural vote that the board had to do so that they can consider these Common Core standards. I've asked every possible way. There is a difference. If you are sitting on a board, I served in the legislature, if you're going to make a motion to consider, that's what it's called. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion. I make a motion that we consider. This was clearly a motion to adopt. So they've tried to explain it away. I don't accept their explanation, and I think most reasonable people aren't going to accept it. The state board would continue to go on with the content standards review. They would go on with their timeline, and they would vote again. So there was a second vote to adopt these standards. But here's something I think is very important. We went through 3 years. They continued on for the next 2 years, so it was essentially about 3 years in total, with what they're continually calling an open process, where educators and parents were notified about public meetings. They took public comment. Here's what's important. Not a single thing was changed in the standards. Not one thing. Nothing. And I've been around the state, I've been around other school districts, school board members have been in the audience, and teachers have been in the audience, and I've said, think about your work on standards in the past. If you've worked on standards or you worked on assessment, you get a group of teachers together. There's never a complete consensus. There's always change. But in Wyoming, we did not change a single thing. So a few thoughts to ponder. One of the things you're going to hear a lot is that the Common Core is state-led because the National Governors Association is the one who brought this and presented it to states. The response to that, and we had Joy Pullman from the Heartland Institute here 2 weeks ago, and she made a great point, that there's, we live under a constitution in this country. There's only one entity that has the authority to essentially speak for us at the state level nationally, and that's called Congress, because we vote for our congressmen. So when we talk about state-led, it is not the National Governors Association. The National Governors Association is a private trade organization that keeps its membership lists private. So you can't even go and find out if Governor Meade is a member unless he volunteers to tell you that. You don't know. We don't know if there are 5 governors in the National Governors Association or 35 governors. We don't know. And also, signing the MOA would allow Wyoming to participate in the process. You hear this a lot from the department. We need to sign the MOA, or we need to be involved in Smarter Balance and the assessment so we can have a seat at the table. Well, the questions that I've been asking is, if we needed to do all this so we were involved in the process, who in Wyoming was involved? Who went and helped write the standards? Well, the answer is no one, and they had to finally admit that. There's no one from Wyoming went and wrote these standards. So essentially, we were not a part of the creation of these standards. These standards were created by the same folks, Achieve Inc., who created the standards back in the 80s and the 90s. These are progressives from the East Coast. Was no one from Wyoming, and we've adopted them in our state. So here are just a few ideas to sum up. Some ideas that we are working on here at the Wyoming Liberty Group as far as education reform, deregulating the private school system and homeschooling, and really allowing for a free and vibrant system. We need to untie the strings on the Common Core and on the state assessment, the Smarter Balance Consortium. We need to develop standards that are stronger or better than the Common Core, if that's the alternative that the legislature wants to accept right now. But we would like to have an open discussion about standards, what standards really do, and who should prescribe standards. I think there's a lot of arrogance in deciding who is going to set standards and what standards are superior. We need to restructure the State Board of Education to make it elected. This all happened because we have a State Board of Education that is appointed. They feel no pressure from you all. The governor appoints them. We need to recalibrate the state education funding model, and Dr. Larson will speak a little bit about that. We need to incentivize districts to also use this backpacking. We need to establish a separate charter authorizer. And then finally, on the waivers. So we did apply for the flexibility waiver, as I was discussing. We applied in February. Last Friday, when we applied for the entire flexibility waiver. Essentially, we were trying to get out from under all of the requirements of No Child Left Behind. We withdrew that waiver a couple weeks ago, mainly because we were not going to receive the waiver. We were behind inside the waiver, and as a continuing push by the federal government, they're asking states to create an accountability system, which Wyoming is embarking on. We are 1 year behind in a portion of that accountability system, and that is the teacher leader evaluation system. So in Wyoming, in the next year, we're going to create an accountability portion that basically says your local teacher or the leader in your building, so your principal in your building, their job performance is going to be directly tied to student growth. So they can be fired essentially for not producing. We're 1 year behind. This is a federal requirement. We aren't making the deadline, so we chose to withdraw and say, hey, we're going to wait. But when we did withdraw, we reapplied for something very small, which was to freeze those AMOs, the annual measurable objectives, to 2012, because next year is 2014. Remember I said the clock was ticking and we were supposed to be proficient at 2014? Well, we're not. So another thing the federal government said was, okay, well then we'll just let you freeze. Inside this waiver, we'll just pretend like 2014 isn't here yet, even though next year 2014 is going to be here. So we have applied for that waiver. We withdrew, but now we're going to reapply. And really inside there, we need to amend our waiver. There are 4 non-statutory provisions that states really need to stand up and say, listen, President Obama, you are going around Congress. This is not the way you do it, and we're not going to abide by these things because we don't have to. We'll see whether the states are willing to stand up. I want to leave you with this. One of the great mistakes is to judge a policy and program by its intentions rather than its results. I've shown you since the 1960s the federal government's involvement in education. Here are results of that involvement. So if you look from 1971 to essentially 2008, these are the scores, reading scores, of 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. Those scores have not changed significantly. And this is the long-term trending that's done on the NAEP, which is a national database that keeps all the scoring. And then here, the Cato Institute put something out that I thought was really, really interesting. Here we're going to juxtaposition those scores. They're down there. So the blue line, let's see if I can run this. So this blue line is total cost, what we're paying in education. Here's the blue line. This red line is employees, so how many people work for the public education system. Enrollment, which is this dashed line, very similar to Wyoming's. We had in the 80s, we kind of dipped down. Then we have the scores, the same ones you saw here, those same scores flatlined. So this is a great way of looking at cost versus results. And that is it.
I have to. Thank you very much. I don't know if you're our secret weapon, but you're definitely our weapon. In Buffalo, they brought somebody out from the Department of Education, some poor lady who was, what was her position?
She's the director of the math standards.
And it was a debate with Amy. So anyway, in case you're inspired to set up a debate with Amy and anybody else, she can come up with the facts. Sven, did you want to say something about backpacking? Backpacking is where the funding goes with the kid. So wherever the kid goes to school, the funding accompanies him rather than going to the district.
I need to grab a mic, Sven.
Dr. Larson is an economist, and those who know us know him.
Can you hear me now? Well,
this is for the recording on the, yeah.
Well, don't get your hopes up. I'm not going to talk for too long. 5 minutes. The reason is that this is such a big issue, the economic dimension of education, that it requires a lot more. It makes a lot more sense to start with what Amy has to say tonight, and I'll just give you a little teaser of what we can say about this in the future. But first of all, I want to say I was involved in the fight for educational choice in Utah 6 years ago. And the Sutherland Institute, our sister think tank out there, tried to introduced a system for backpacking, school backpacking, a backpacking funding model where you would get a $3,000 voucher that you could bring to any school. We did the numbers, I did the numbers on would low-income families be able to afford that. And it sounds very little, $3,000, but as the numbers came out, there was no way they would not be able to afford adding a little bit of money on top of that. If you gave $3,000, essentially everybody would have an opportunity to choose a school. Now, there are a couple of conditions behind that to keep the cost of the voucher down that I'll get back to. But what happened in Utah when this modest voucher system or school backpacking system was introduced was that the national educational posse rolled in down the Wasatch Front and all over Utah and launched a nasty campaign filled with lies and innuendo, and it was really, really bad. And those poor people at the Sutherland Institute did their best to be nice and courteous and truthful, and they lost the referendum 60-40. Now, the main thing to learn about that is that you have to be prepared. You have to know in advance what you're up against, and the barrage of lies that are going to follow whenever you try to introduce a school, any kind of educational freedom as part of the everyday educational experience that families have. Any kind of school backpacking is going to go up against a very, very vicious resistance. And now they have the entire White House behind them as well. A couple of things that you need to have in order to, a lot of people think that, is it really possible, can we really create a genuine choice with a voucher or a backpacking system with just $4,000 at the most? Yes, it is entirely possible. Here's what you have to do. You have to take away all the regulations that say a school has to look like this or like that. You all know what the shrines look like in every little village around Wyoming that they have built to public education. You don't need that. There's a little house out, I think if you go out State Route 210 here, you'll come to a little house, was a school from 1990 to 1930, something like that. It's a one classroom little school, but kids were actually educated there. You can choose yourself what kind of school building you want to have. Take away those regulations. Take away the regulations that say you have to have teachers that have a certain number of credentials. Let the schools decide, and then let the parents decide, do I want to put my kid in that school, or do I want to put my kid in another school? There are going to be those who want the teachers with immaculate formal credentials. And then there are going to be those who say, you know what, this school has a math teacher who was an engineer for Ford Motor Company for a long time. He knows how to make math practical. I'm going to put my kid there. Allow entrepreneurs in education to choose exactly what kind of services they want to offer, and then let the backpacking system go to work. But there is one more requirement, and we have to keep this in mind. If you allow taxpayers to be liable for the funding, then you are not going to have genuine choice, because the legislators are going to be the ones who decide what to attach to that money. Elected officials can never allow taxpayers to have full choice of how to use their own tax money without attaching something to it. So, as part of a reform to create a genuine school backpacking system, we also need to introduce private funding of the vouchers. Private scholarships that are just as recognized, just as accessible as any kind of tax-funded voucher at the onset. And the long-term goal will be to totally phase out the tax-paid part. So the main two things you need to do, and this is entirely possible, is to deregulate the production side, which is let people define what a school is themselves. Let the entrepreneurs and the parents decide that. And on the other side, let anyone who has money to set up enough to set up a scholarship do so, and give money to whoever needs it so they can go to whatever school they want. So we need to deregulate production and financing. And once we've done that, it's not very hard to do. But once we do, if we do that, excuse me, if we do that and we do it on both sides at the same time, we're going to open for a free market in education and give the choice back to the parents. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about this later this fall. This was just a teaser. One more thing about the funding as it looks now. You can probably expect this federal funding to go away pretty rapidly or to shrink. And for every dime it shrinks, for every dollar it shrinks, don't expect the regulations to go away. The regulations will increase and the funding is going to decrease until you don't get any money and you have no freedom to define how you want to run your education system. That is the danger with federal money. It is only going to go one way. It looks very nice now to get all this money, but believe me, we are at a turning point when it comes to the federal government and its fiscal situation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sven. Thank you. Just to be clear, I think you probably understand this, and that's probably one reason you're here. But if the progressives have their way, the children will be all taught the same thing. It'll be a monoculture. You will not have any homeschooling. I mean, I don't know if you saw the case in Germany where a homeschooling family was just arrested. You won't have any private schooling. And all the universities, it'll be like, I don't know, PAP. It'll be a monoculture. And America is now still the most creative country in the world. We're the most generous country in the world. So there's no reason we have to put up with this. Rich Crandall is now the current Director of Education. He is very big on what he calls blended education. Blended education is where you have a computer tutorial, and you have to learn that and master that. And then theoretically, you discuss it with the teacher and you get work groups and so on. In the right hands, that's a wonderful idea, but it's also the propagandist's dream that every kid master this tutorial. So it's creepy. Please come and look at these wonderful graphics. We've worked hard on them, and they have a lot of information. I'd like you to just to introduce the Wyoming Liberty Group staff who's here. Chad, the quiet man behind the camera, Chad Evans is our operations guy and doing a lot with video. And he and Mandy, you met Mandy when you came in. Mandy had an inspiration for this booth that's in the back corner of the room. Now, a couple of people here have some experience with it. Lena has done with her daughter, and where's Maureen Hurley had done, and it's a wonderful thing. You stand in front of the camera. Do you want to say anything about it, Lena, about your experience with it?
I think I was just more nervous than what it really.
You came across very well. Basically, you do a brief speech, and you're videoed, and then we send you the YouTube of the video, and you can send that to the governor. I mean, you should have seen Maureen look at the I'm talking to the governor. I'm talking to the director of education. I'm talking to you people. I'm serious about this. Nobody's going to mess with Maureen. And so people tend to speak for about 1 or 2 minutes. It gives them a chance to say what they're going to say. And then you have control of your video, because you get to, we email it to you and then you forward it to the person you want. So Mandy has quite an inspiration to get that together, and she and Chad put that together. Also in the back, we have Maureen Bader, who you hear from in constant contact, and of course Dr. Larson, and his wife Christina, who has recently joined us to help with development. We definitely need help there. And then Captain Gay is an economist and an attorney. And so, did I miss anybody? Oh, Bruce. Bruce is our. If you came to the summer movie series, you saw Bruce in action, and we're hoping to do some more movies. Okay. One of the things that we thought you'd like to know, as far as this, is what the choices are if you're not going to be regulated and have your children taken over. First thing is deregulate. 2 homeschool families can't get together, hire a teacher, and have, a little school, even for their little kids. It's illegal in Wyoming. Too many. So even at that level, it's regulated. But this is about starting with the cheapest kind of education for kids. Homeschooling, maybe the kid's just part of the family, and you pay $200 for some curriculum, or you can take it up from there, take them on field trips and so on. Sabbath International Public Schools there's this book called Beautiful Tree, and it's about private education in places like Nigeria slums, Mumbai, India, China, and they have international schools that cost about the same as I looked up some figures, about the same as a Catholic school education. It varies a lot with the circumstances, but about $6,000 a year for tuition. Multifamily homeschools, if it were deregulated, you pay a teacher's salary, say, of $30,000, and depending on how many kids, if you've got 10 kids, that's $3,000 a kid. Public charter schools vary a lot, $4,000 to $14,000 tuition. Wyoming public schools, the cheapest is around $15,000. It varies from district to district and how many kids are in the school. If it's very small, it's more, $41,000 a kid in one of the Sheridan schools. Private boarding schools, around the same thing, $45,000, $46,000. Wyoming incarcerated youth, we arrest about 10% of our young people, mostly boys between the ages of 15 and 17. And we have about 33,000 incarcerated. And that varies according to the degree of security from 60,000 to 108,000 a year, something like that. And there's no excuse for that. We need community diversion programs. We don't have them really in Wyoming. So that's the most expensive. So I guess that's it. And we're open for questions.
Are you actually saying that in Sheridan, Wyoming, there's a school that it costs the taxpayers $41,000 a year to educate one child?
Per child, yes. Claremont,
In
it's,
God's name, okay, is that?
well, it's a school district, so school districts are set by your State Department of Education and your legislature. It's Claremont in Sheridan County 1.
Some of that has to do with transportation.
Yeah,
costs,
there's
stuff like that.
296 students in that school, so it's a very, very small school
Yeah,
district.
and having gone through the numbers with Department of Ed on a charter school that we were putting together here in Laramie County, there's a range that they've got to deal with and they've got to offset. So Laramie County is actually less than some of the more rural school districts because they have an increasing per student cost for transportation. If you've got to drive 40 or 50 miles to get kids all over a large dispersed area, you're going to eat up a lot of fuel and obviously a lot of maintenance on a vehicle. So.
Yep. Maureen, she's bringing the mic, so hold on.
Yes, you mentioned that the State Board of Education legally sets the standards here in the state.
Yes.
Since that was not done, is it possible to sue the state, to bring a lawsuit against the state because they went against their own legislation?
Right. Well, the state board ultimately did adopt the standards. So the question, and we've had some folks ask, I wish Steve Klein was here, one of our staff attorneys, but he had to go to a different meeting this evening. That question has been asked. Is this something that states could pursue, that all these governors were signing this MOA and we're essentially saying we're going to adopt these standards? I don't know that answer exactly, Maureen. Clearly, Commissioner Scott in Texas saw that he did not have the legal authority to do it, and I think he's correct.
Okay. How does SF 104 figure in on all this?
Yeah. Well, it's not in the timeline. So that was happening. Essentially, the standards had already been adopted. Basically, it was because the second vote happened in 2012 when Superintendent Hill was already in office. So that vote had happened. So it was in spring of last year. The standards had been adopted. However, we had not applied for the flexibility waivers yet. At that time, the Superintendent Hill was not going to apply. That's my understanding. She was not going to apply for those flexibility waivers. As soon as 104 was passed, an interim director was put in place, which was Jim Rose, we applied for those flexibility waivers. So that's, it kind of gives you an idea of what was happening. And then you, Emily, I'll go back.
Okay. Do you happen to know exactly who was in office, or was it Dave Friedenthal, or when Common Core curriculum was accepted and adopted into our school district? And can you find out by any chance how much money changed hands from the federal government to the Wyoming school system and everything? Because you know darn good and well somebody was paid in some way, shape, or form to bring this Common Core curriculum into our system, because nobody in their right mind, a legislator that was wanting to help Wyoming be, Wyoming, nobody would do this.
Well, at the time, it was Governor Friedenthal when it began. Wyoming did apply for $164 million of Race to the Top monies. We did not get that money. So, but what I like to talk about, because you'll have a lot of people on the other side say, there's no federal money involved. We didn't take any money. Well, it's not that we didn't take any money. We applied. Yeah. We wanted that money. We simply didn't get it. But there was a motive there. And of course, that was phase one. The Department of Education had, and I have it here, had a whole sort of scenario A and scenario B of how they were going to go about. There were 3 phases to Race to the Top. So there was really, if you didn't get phase 1, you could hurry up and apply for phase 2, and we saw states doing that. Wyoming knew that we had to get those standards adopted, because if we didn't get the money, we would go on and apply for phase 2. Now, ultimately, we did not do that, and I don't know why we didn't apply for phase 2. So we applied for money, we did not receive it.
Okay, in other words, Common Core curriculum would not have been adopted more than likely if there wasn't this big carrot of all the money out there. Absolutely. And I would just about bet you my life that something else happened. Either the federal government said, we'll let you drill on more federal land or something. The money may not have come across, because that looks like a bribe. Okay, but I'll bet you something transpired for our dear sweet Dave Friedenthal. that said that let him go, okay, let's do this?
Well, there were a lot of things happening in D.C. So we applied for Raise the Top. We didn't get it. And the next spring, early spring, I think it was February of 2011, the Obama administration came out and said, we're going to attach Title I funds to Common Core. So if you don't adopt the Common Core, we're going to yank your Title I funds. That ultimately didn't happen, but it put states in a panic. So the federal government was coming up with all kinds of ways to incentivize, we can call it strong arm, states into adopting these standards.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Commissioner Lee in the back.
Amy, being a previous legislator, you might understand this. This next budget session is coming up. It takes 2/3 of the legislator to stop anything. But is there any legislators out there with a good attorney to draw up something that would say this state of Wyoming does not want Common Core, and to just stop it right through the legislation? Or we need another do some sort of action to stop it through the legislature, since they weren't involved anyway. The key is that Wyoming has its hand out through our elected officials right now to take that money, and they don't realize how many strings are attached to federal money. And if we can get it stopped, it's going to be through legislation, I believe. So I'd like to see the Liberty Group work on some proposed language and find a legislature, at least bring it up. And you're doing a great job educating everybody throughout the state on Common Core, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Yeah, so other states have been taking this legislative action. So in Michigan, they defunded the Common Core. In Indiana, they passed a bill. In Pennsylvania, the governor there did it through his executive powers. And essentially what all three of those states are doing is either defunding, they're stopping implementation, slowing it down, taking it back to the people. They're not removing the standards per se, because they want to replace them or do something else. And as you understand, standards work takes time. It usually takes 1 to 2 years. But essentially, states are beginning to backpedal away. Georgia got out of the assessment piece. The Speaker of the House in Oklahoma has said that he's going to try to remove the standards in Oklahoma. So yes, in Wyoming, the route is probably going to be legislatively. I have spoken to some legislators who are willing to share with me that they are drafting some legislation. The uphill battle in Wyoming is that we are coming up on a budget session. It requires a 2/3 vote for introduction of any non-budget bill. So the best probably mechanism that they're going to use is going to be a footnote or a footnote on the budget bill itself. So during first, second, and third reading on the floor of both the House and the Senate, you can attach an amendment to the budget bill. I think some of the policy, and it doesn't require a 2/3 vote, it's just a simple majority to get it on there. So I think that's what some legislators will be pursuing. Another question?
This may sound kind of vague, and I'm trying to connect the dots here, but was Senate File 104 at all connected to this Common Core monster? I mean, serum.
You know, I personally can't make that leap because I don't have the facts to speak it. And I know that the Superintendent Hill's been on the record as saying that she didn't oppose the standards as standards, she opposed the process. I think she also recognized that this was not as open and transparent as, and she was a no vote in the second vote that they had. Okay, they had the first vote in 2010, they had a second vote in 2012. She was a no vote, but of course they had the votes on the board, it did pass.
All right.
So they got the standards, even with her still in office. Oh, and then Maureen.
I see a lot of institutes and foundations on the national level.
Yes.
Are those private institutes? How much funding did they provide, or how were they involved?
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is probably the biggest one. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And for brevity tonight, I took a lot of stuff out of my presentation that I've been using. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so simultaneously in 2008, 2009, and 2010, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was giving money essentially to national organizations like the National Association of School Boards, state school boards, CSG, the Council of State Governments, which all state legislators belong to, so Wyoming belongs to CSG. A lot of your legislators travel to their events and listen to meetings. And so Bill and Melinda Gates was giving a lot of money. They gave a lot of money to the University of North Carolina to implement all kinds of teacher qualities around the Common Core. The Fordham Institute, heavily funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. So the Fordham Institute came out with what everybody called was sort of the gold standard of looking at all the state standards and comparing them to the Common Core. And that research project was funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. And guess what it said? It said that the Common Core was far superior. There was only a couple of states that they just could not make the leap. Massachusetts was one of them. It is clear nationally that Massachusetts, under Dr. Stotsky's work, gave up world-class standards for $250 million worth of Race to the Top funds.
Carolyn Passage.
Carolyn.
My question is, and maybe you can't answer this, in regard to the proposed legislation that could be coming, is it to Deep Six Common Core, or is it to defund it? Is it to just get through another year so that we actually can do what we think we might be able to do? Can you answer that?
I can't. Out of respect for the legislators who haven't made it public, and because they have strategies they want to deal with,
Okay.
I'm not going to.
Then I would just go one step further with that. And in my mind, in listening to your presentation, Amy, I believe that the children and the parents, and probably all of us, are victims. And I'm wondering if a whisper campaign by us and parents would be sensible this year, or wait for a year?
No, I think it needs to happen right now. I mean, Susan's talked about we need to, when we're gathering strength, I mean, I'm seeing groups all over the state. I've been out and about. We have moms in Cody. We have moms in Thermopolis. We have moms in Riverton, Lander, DuBois. I've been to Buffalo, Rock Springs, Green River. I can give you, there's www.wyomingcitizensopposingcommoncore.com. So there's groups out there. There's a Facebook page with over 600 folks on it. It needs to happen now, and it's building momentum.
These are packed meetings, very fully attended. Yeah.
One question.
One more question, yeah.
Do you happen to know if MS in MSNBC stands for Microsoft? Well, I've heard it does, and it makes sense.
Does it?
It was a blend, and I can tell you I've done some work on some promotional collateral. The LA Unified School District put out within the last 6 months an RFP. The RFP was to provide tablet computers for every single student in the LA Unified School District, all 660,000.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that the software on that's probably open source, but one of the things that Bill Gates has talked about, and it makes, I mean, whether he's a progressive or not doesn't even matter, business person, he understands what he's talking about. When you have a tablet that has documented what a child has done from kindergarten through 10th grade, your targeted marketing can be so effective as to be almost impossible to shut down. And you can out-Google Google, if you want to put it that way. And Bill Gates recognizes that, and that's why he's involved. I think that's one of the reasons why he's involved, my thoughts.
Yeah, and I haven't even touched on, we didn't touch on tonight the assessment, the other book piece, we didn't touch on the assessment or the data collection that's going to be involved in all of this. We haven't even touched that.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to have you, and please stay around, have some refreshments, and have some conversation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.